It was supposed to be an ordinary day, the kind where work is routine and expectations are clear. But for Camille Johnson, it was anything but. Camille Johnson, a 28-year-old Harvard graduate and rising star in the tech industry, had just been appointed as the vice president of operations at one of the top firms in Chicago. But as she stepped into the sleek, modern lobby, she felt the familiar weight of skepticism pressing against her. The glances from the receptionist, the guards, even the employees passing by, it wasn't new, but it still stung. She carried herself with grace, knowing that her presence alone challenged expectations. The elevator chimed softly as she stepped inside, sharing the space with a few others. Just before the doors closed, a tall, imposing man, Mr. Robert Mather in his mid-40s, strode in. His tailored suit and confident demeanor screamed authority. He glanced at Camille, and his smirk told her all she needed to know. "You must be new here," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let me guess, marketing intern?" Camille raised an eyebrow, her expression calm. "Not quite. But thank you for the welcome." The man chuckled, shaking his head as if she'd said something amusing. Camille didn't elaborate. The elevator stopped, and he stepped off without another word. She stayed behind, riding it to the executive floor. The conference room was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Camille entered quietly, noting the cluster of executives already seated. She walked confidently to the head of the table and placed her briefcase down. The murmurs began immediately. "What's going on?" whispered one man. "Why is she sitting there?" asked another. At the far end of the table sat the man from the elevator. His face twisted into a scowl. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered under his breath. The room fell silent as the CEO, an older man named Howard Langston, entered. His presence commanded respect, and everyone rose as he took his seat. "Good morning, everyone," Langston began, his tone brisk. "Before we dive into today's agenda, I'd like to introduce you to someone very important." All eyes turned to Camille as Langston gestured toward her. "This is Camille Johnson, our new vice president of operations. She's here to lead our restructuring efforts and ensure the success of our AI division." The room erupted in polite applause, though it lacked genuine enthusiasm. Camille met their gazes one by one, her expression unreadable. Robert Mathers, the man from the elevator, leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Restructuring, huh? That's ambitious," he said, his tone barely masking his disdain. "What's your background, Ms. Johnson?" Camille didn't flinch. "I've worked in operational strategy for the past 6 years, including leading a $2 billion turnaround project for Halcyon Industries. My focus is on optimizing efficiency and driving innovation." "Is there anything specific you'd like to know?" Her response was measured, professional, and left no room for argument. Robert smirked but said nothing further. Camille proceeded to deliver her presentation, laying out her vision for the company with precision. As she spoke, it became clear that she was not only knowledgeable but also determined. By the end of the meeting, even the most skeptical executives were taking notes. The hum of the office grew faint as the last few employees wrapped up their day. The once bustling space was now quiet, lit only by the soft glow of overhead lights. Camille sat at her desk, meticulously organizing her files and reviewing the notes from the day's meeting. The view outside her window revealed the city skyline shimmering against the twilight, a sight that usually brought her a sense of calm. But tonight, there was an undercurrent of unease she couldn't shake. As she placed her laptop into her sleek leather bag, the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were deliberate, heavier than the casual pace of a coworker heading out for the evening. Camille straightened, her instincts sharpening. She turned her head just as Robert Mathers appeared in the doorway of her office, leaning against the frame with a smug expression. "Quite the performance in there," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. His arms were crossed over his broad chest, and the faint smirk playing on his lips spoke of disdain more than humor. "I'll admit, you had some of the folks eating out of the palm of your hand." Camille met his gaze, her face impassive. "If you have feedback about the presentation, Mr. Mathers, I'd be happy to hear it in tomorrow's meeting," she replied, her tone professional but edged with a quiet firmness. Robert let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he stepped further into the room. "No need to be so formal, Johnson. I just thought I'd give you a little piece of advice. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. People like you don't last long in places like this. The words hit like a punch, but Camille didn't flinch. She sat up straighter, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. She had heard variations of this phrase before, veiled threats wrapped in condescension, meant to undermine her confidence and remind her of the barriers she wasn't supposed to cross. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Mathers, she said, her voice steady. But I'll let my work speak for itself. Robert's smirk deepened, as though he found her response amusing. Suit yourself, he said, turning to leave. But he paused in the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder. Just stay in your lane, Johnson. You might find things go easier for you that way. For a moment, the air felt heavy, the weight of his words pressing down like a tangible force. Camille kept her composure, her expression giving away nothing as she watched him walk away. His footsteps receded down the hall, and soon the office was quiet once more. When she was certain he was gone, Camille exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders as she leaned back in her chair. The exchange replayed in her mind, each word laced with the kind of venom she had encountered so many times before. It wasn't new, but it wasn't any easier to endure. She stared out the window for a moment, the lights of the city below flickering like tiny beacons of hope. She reminded herself why she was here, not to prove him wrong, but to prove herself right. This wasn't about one man's prejudice. It was about carving a space where she, and others like her, could thrive without having to apologize for it. With renewed determination, she zipped up her bag and stood. As she flipped off the office lights and stepped into the quiet hallway, she told herself one thing: I've faced worse than him. And I'm still here. The weeks that followed Camille's first meeting were fraught with tension. While most of the team gradually adjusted to her presence and even began to respect her leadership, Robert Mathers grew increasingly antagonistic. His hostility was subtle at first, barely disguised sarcasm in meetings, dismissive remarks about her plans, and cutting her off mid-sentence. But as Camille's authority became undeniable, Robert's actions turned overt. He began questioning her qualifications openly, implying in front of colleagues that her decisions were risky and uninformed. Behind the scenes, whispers started circulating. Some employees confided in Camille that Robert was spreading rumors about how she had gotten the job, accusing her of being a token hire or leveraging connections. It was the kind of insidious undermining Camille had seen before, and while it was infuriating, she refused to let it derail her focus. The tension finally came to a head during a high-profile company event, the annual Innovation Summit. Held in the grand ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel, the event was Magnus Tech's opportunity to showcase its progress to investors, partners, and the tech world at large. The room buzzed with anticipation as executives, engineers, and stakeholders mingled under crystal chandeliers. Camille had been selected as the keynote speaker, tasked with presenting Magnus Tech's future strategy. It was an honor and a responsibility that underscored her pivotal role in the company's direction. She had spent weeks preparing, her presentation refined to perfection. As the evening unfolded, Camille stood near the stage, waiting for her turn. She scanned the audience, catching sight of familiar faces. Investors leaned forward in their seats, eager for the vision that could salvage Magnus Tech's precarious position in the industry. Employees whispered excitedly, proud to see their company represented on such a prestigious platform. And then there was Robert, seated near the back, his arms crossed and his face a mask of thinly veiled disdain. He made no effort to hide his displeasure, his eyes narrowing as the board chairman stepped up to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman began, his voice echoing through the grand ballroom. Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing someone who represents the very best of Magnus Tech's future. Camille Johnson joined us just a few months ago, but in that short time, she has already proven herself as a visionary leader. Her expertise in operational strategy and her dedication to innovation have been instrumental in shaping the path forward for our AI division. The chairman paused, glancing toward Camille with a warm smile. Please join me in welcoming our Vice President of Operations, Ms. Camille Johnson. The room erupted into applause. Camille took a steadying breath, smoothing the front of her blazer as she walked onto the stage. Her heels clicked against the polished wood floor, the sound drowned out by the enthusiastic clapping. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and surveyed the audience. "Thank you, Mr. Langston, for that generous introduction," Camille began, her voice calm and confident. "It's an honor to stand before you tonight, representing the incredible talent and potential of Magnus Tech Solutions." Her opening was measured, establishing her credibility while acknowledging the collaborative efforts of the team. She spoke with precision, outlining her vision for the company, a future rooted in innovation, inclusivity, and sustainability. Her words painted a vivid picture of how Magnus Tech could not only recover but thrive, becoming a leader in the tech industry once again. Camille's speech seamlessly wove together hard data, personal anecdotes, and forward-thinking strategies. But one of the most powerful moments came when she addressed diversity and collaboration. Magnus Tech's strength lies not only in its technology but in its people, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. The best innovations come from diverse minds working together, challenging each other, and striving for excellence. It's time for us to break down the barriers that hold us back and build a culture where everyone, regardless of their background, can contribute their unique brilliance. The audience erupted into applause, several attendees rising to their feet in appreciation of her message. Camille smiled, her confidence unwavering as she took a step back from the podium. But as she scanned the crowd, her eyes fell on Robert. He remained seated, his expression stormy. While the others clapped and cheered, he sat stiffly, his arms still crossed over his chest, a scowl etched deeply into his features. After the event, as the attendees filed out of the ballroom, Camille stood near the stage, speaking briefly with the chairman and a few key investors. Their words of praise and encouragement buoyed her spirits, but she remained aware of Robert lingering at the edge of the room, his glare burning into her back. As the crowd thinned, Robert finally made his move. He cornered Camille in the hallway just outside the ballroom. The air was heavy with tension, the distant hum of conversation fading into the background. "This is ridiculous," he hissed, his voice low but laced with anger. "You think you're some kind of savior, don't you? Up there preaching about diversity like you're the second coming of Silicon Valley. Let me tell you something, Johnson, you're just a diversity hire. That's it. That's all you'll ever be." Camille stared at him, her usually calm exterior finally cracking. The anger she had kept carefully in check bubbled to the surface. She took a step closer, her voice low but sharp. "You've crossed the line, Robert," she said, her words deliberate and cutting. "And I'm done tolerating it." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but Camille wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, her tone icy. "Let me make one thing clear. I earned my place here. Every single bit. And you've spent the past few weeks trying to tear me down because you can't stand the idea of someone like me holding power over someone like you." Robert's face reddened, his composure faltering for the first time. "Don't you?" "No," Camille interrupted, her voice rising just enough to silence him. "You don't get to interrupt me anymore. You don't get to make excuses or hide behind your years of tenure. Your behavior ends now." She took a step back, her gaze unwavering. "I've worked too hard to let someone like you derail me. You want to keep testing me? Fine. But be prepared for the consequences." Without waiting for a response, Camille turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Robert stood frozen, his jaw clenched, the weight of her words hanging in the air long after she had disappeared from view. As Camille stepped into the cool night air, she felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, and determination. The confrontation had been inevitable, and while it had shaken her, it had also reaffirmed her purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been underestimated, sidelined, or dismissed. Meanwhile, back in the hotel, Robert remained in the hallway, his mind racing. For the first time, he couldn't shake the uncomfortable truth that Camille's words had forced him to confront. He had been wrong, and now he would have to face the consequences. The next morning, Camille sat at her desk, the early sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office. The tension from the previous evening still lingered, but she channeled it into her work, reviewing reports and drafting strategies with laser focus. She knew what had to be done. By mid-morning, she picked up her phone and dialed Robert's extension. "Robert, I need to see you in my office," she said curtly. There was no warmth in her tone, no room for debate. A tense 5 minutes passed before Robert appeared in her doorway. He stood there, arms crossed, trying to project confidence, but Camille could see the hesitation in his eyes. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Yes, come in," Camille replied, motioning toward the chair in front of her desk. Robert stepped inside, his posture rigid. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood with his hands on his hips, towering over her in what he clearly hoped would be an intimidating stance. Camille, unbothered, leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "I'm aware of your comments about me," Camille began, her voice cold and precise. "Not just the ones you made last night, but the remarks you've been making for weeks, about me and about other employees in this company. It stops now." Robert scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, come on. Are you really going to sit there and lecture me? Let's not pretend this is about the company. This is about you trying to make a name for yourself." Camille didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she continued as though he hadn't spoken. "Your behavior has been disruptive, unprofessional, and frankly, unacceptable. I've tolerated it longer than I should have, but that ends today." Robert shifted uncomfortably but tried to maintain his bravado. "You can't fire me, Johnson," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I've been here for over 20 years. You're just a VP, someone they brought in to shake things up. Let's see how long you last." Camille's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing. "You're right, Robert. I can't fire you." She paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing, her tone icy. "But I can report you to HR, and I can ensure that your behavior is formally documented. I can also make sure that you undergo mandatory sensitivity training. And you will be issuing a public apology to the team." Robert's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Sensitivity training? Public apology? That's ridiculous." "What's ridiculous," Camille shot back, her voice rising slightly, "is that you think you can continue to act this way without consequences. Your tenure doesn't make you immune to accountability. In fact, it makes your behavior even more unacceptable because you should know better." Robert's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to argue, but Camille wasn't finished. "Let me be clear. This is your one chance to fix things. If you refuse, I'll escalate this to the board. And if you think they'll side with you after the stunt you pulled last night, you're welcome to test that theory." The room fell silent. Robert's bravado was gone now, replaced by a mixture of anger and fear. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'll do it." Camille leaned forward slightly, her tone sharp. "Not good enough. I want to hear you say it clearly. Do you agree to sensitivity training and a public apology?" Robert met her gaze reluctantly. "Yes," he said through gritted teeth. "I agree." Camille sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Good. You'll receive an email later today with the details. I expect your apology to the team to be sincere, or we'll revisit this conversation." Robert left her office without another word, his shoulders stiff and his movements mechanical. Camille watched him go, exhaling slowly once he was out of sight. She felt a flicker of relief but also a deep sense of weariness. She knew this wasn't the end of the issue. It was only the beginning of a longer process to create lasting change within the company. By mid-afternoon, HR had sent Robert the official documentation for his training and apology. Word spread quickly throughout the office, and while some employees were surprised, others felt vindicated. Robert Mathers, who had long been untouchable, was finally being held accountable. Camille, however, didn't linger on the drama. She had no interest in seeing Robert humiliated. Her goal wasn't revenge, it was accountability. She hoped that this experience would force him to reflect and change, though she wasn't naive enough to expect a complete transformation overnight. That evening, as she packed up her things, she received an email from one of her colleagues, a junior employee who had witnessed Robert's behavior over the years. The subject line simply read, "Thank you." Camille opened the message and read, "Camille, I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to Robert. He's been a problem for a long time, but no one ever had the courage to confront him. You've made this office a better place for all of us." A small smile crossed Camille's lips. She closed her laptop, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked out of the building, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This was why she was here, to create a workplace where everyone could thrive, free from intimidation and prejudice. Months passed, and Camille's efforts began to bear fruit. Under her leadership, the company implemented a series of sweeping reforms designed to foster equity and accountability. Diversity and inclusion training became mandatory for all employees, from entry-level staff to senior executives. Clear policies were established to address workplace misconduct, and a transparent reporting system was introduced to ensure that employees felt safe raising concerns without fear of retaliation. The cultural shift was palpable. Employees began to feel empowered, their voices valued in ways they hadn't been before. Camille's unwavering commitment to these changes earned her widespread respect, not just for her strategic brilliance but for her courage in confronting systemic issues head-on. She became a symbol of what strong, ethical leadership could achieve. Meanwhile, Robert's world had changed dramatically. Initially resentful of the mandatory sensitivity training and his public apology, he resisted the process, attending sessions with barely disguised disdain. But as the weeks went by, the stories he heard from colleagues, stories of microaggressions, exclusion, and outright discrimination, began to penetrate his defenses. For the first time, he saw himself not as a victim of change but as a perpetrator of harm. Gradually, Robert began to take responsibility for his actions. He started attending company forums, not as an observer but as a participant, sharing his own story as a cautionary tale. His candor surprised many, and while not everyone forgave him, his willingness to confront his past helped spark important conversations. He became an unlikely advocate for reform, using his experiences to highlight the dangers of unchecked bias and the importance of accountability. The transformation wasn't easy or immediate, but it was real. And while Robert's journey was far from over, he was no longer the man he had been. Years later, Camille and Robert found themselves on the same stage at a public panel on workplace equity. Camille, now a nationally recognized leader in organizational reform, was the keynote speaker. Her address captivated the audience, weaving together her experiences, insights, and a call to action for businesses to embrace meaningful change. As she spoke, Robert sat quietly at the edge of the panel, listening intently. He was no longer the man who dismissed Camille as a diversity hire. Now, he was an advocate for workplace equity, sharing his story of reckoning and growth as an example of how even those entrenched in their biases could change. When the panel ended, their eyes met across the room. For a moment, there was no hostility, no lingering tension, just a shared understanding of the journey they had both undertaken. Robert approached Camille hesitantly, his usual bravado replaced with humility. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for holding me accountable. I didn't see it back then, but you gave me a chance to change." Camille nodded, her expression calm but warm. "Accountability isn't about revenge," she replied. "It's about making sure the harm stops here." "Keep proving it, Robert." "I will," he promised. And for the first time, Camille believed him. This story isn't just about one man's prejudice or one woman's courage. It's about the systems we live in and the choices we make to challenge them. Real change starts with accountability. For ourselves, for others, and for the institutions that shape our lives. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us as we uncover stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Thank you for being here. See you in the next video.